Ladies and gentlemen of the media, good day to you and thank you for joining us at this press conference for January 10, 2025. We have to my immediate left the leader of the Alliance for Change, Mr. Nigel Hughes, and we are joined online by Dr. Vincent Adams, the Honorable Director of Finance, Member of Parliament, and we are expected to be joined online shortly by David Patterson. Coming in to the table in a little while will be Ms. Laurie George, advisor to the Alliance for Change on Indigenous Affairs. But let me start by saying that it is the AFC's position that Venezuela continues to perfect a hybrid warfare strategy against Guyana, while the PPP twiddles its thumbs. There is no doubt that Venezuela is calculatedly and systematically moving pieces in place for an eventual event, that is, the seizure and occupation of part of Guyana's land. In military parlance, this is called a fait accompli. These activities are taking place just below the threshold of actual war. But Guyanese should have no illusions that Venezuela is not waging war against our beloved nation. Building bridges, fortifying and cocoa, cyber attacks, and appointing governors are only the most recent indicators that we have seen, but much more is taking place below the surface. We are well advised to stay alert and to stay engaged with our international and strategic partners as we are doing. However, our failure as a government is that the people and their elected representatives are not being engaged and instead are deliberately being kept in the dark. There has to be a whole of government and whole of nation approach that includes all strata of our society and all elected representatives. If the PPP believes that it can confront this sinister plot alone and exclude the ready, capable, and patriotic efforts of the parliamentary opposition, cat will eat our dinner. While the PPP parades and prances around to gain voter support, our neighbor to the west is not playing. We demand the immediate convening of the Foreign Relations Committee and the reconvening of a bipartisan border national security committee to ensure all hands are at work. This is in the best interest of our beloved nation. I will now ask the leader of the Alliance for Change, Mr. Nigel Hughes, to make some opening remarks. Nigel?
Good afternoon, members of the press. Thank you very much again for joining us this week. We all are now aware of the fact that the budget will be presented to the National Assembly on the 17th, and we wanted to indicate what the AFC's position is in relation to certain budget items, both at the macro level and also at the micro level. We believe that this election year is going to see a lot of wild promises across the political spectrum. And if we are not careful and responsible, and if we don't establish the framework within which we are going to make these wild assertions, we run very real risk that the country may be placed in economic danger. So the first recommendation we have, which is one that one that emanates from the International Monetary Fund, is that the non-oil primary deficit as a share of the non-oil GDP should expand only by the sum of the oil revenues withdrawn from the National Resource Fund and foreign borrowing. So we think that overall principle should not only be a policy, but we should legislate that as a fiscal measure. In terms of the micro level, we have the following proposals, and this will be included in the Alliance for Change manifesto. Anybody earning $2 million or less will pay no income tax. persons earning between 2 million and 10 million Guyana dollars per annum will pay 15% income tax, and anybody earning in excess of $10 million per annum will pay 20% income tax. That is our overall fiscal proposal in relation to making sure that more people in the country have increased disposable income so that they can spend it, they can invest it, they can improve their homes. And just for clarity, I'll just repeat that. If you're earning 2 million or less per annum, no income tax. 2 to 10, 15%, and above 10, 20%. We believe that that will not cause any significant damage to the current fiscal regime and the fiscal regime going forward. In relation to GCOM, we have noted that they expressed recently, might have been yesterday or the day before, that they are capable of holding a credible election. You would have to be possessed of the most creative imagination if any institution, after having admitted the errors that GCOM has admitted recently, after having failed to rectify the Dr. Kissoon issue solely as a result of their own recommendations, after having a slew of missteps, and after having had every election challenged for some reason or the other that anybody would repose any confidence or attribute any credibility to any institution like GCOM, which has demonstrated consistently its inability and its incapacity to operate. And therefore, GCOM making a press statement in the absence of any demonstrated capacity to deliver in terms of elections, and we certainly have the 2020 elections as an example, cannot possibly expect the Guyanese public to take it seriously in this regard. We would like to repeat everything that we have said before in relation to GCOM, including having the chair of GCOM resign, step down from her position. We are now in 2025, and on GCOM's admission, we have a person sitting in the National Assembly and continuing to sit in the National Assembly who, as a result of their error, ought not to be there. And they have not had the decency to provide to this country any course of action they intend to take to rectify their error. So, with the greatest respect to GCOM, your press releases do not offer any confidence whatsoever. The third issue that I'd like to address is the issue of the census. We are now halfway in January 2025, an election year, a year by which elections are statutorily due, and therefore we find it completely unacceptable that there be no release of any information in relation to the census, which was due 3 years ago in 2022. We believe that this will only add to further difficulties in relation to the process leading up to the conduct of the elections, and of course, as we have consistently done at every elections, challenge the result of those elections. We believe that the situation in relation to the non-release of the census figures has gone past crisis and has now put us in a position where it's fertile ground for those who have difficulties with the integrity of the election, with the integrity of data generally, that at this stage, lots of speculation will take place, and unfortunately in a country like ours, that leads to unfortunate consequences. Those are my statements for today. I actually have one other statement. Laura George is not here as yet, but I understand that the students and teachers of Aishalton Secondary School, not Aishalton, sorry, St. Ignatius Secondary School in Region 9 have no running water. And this is in a time where we are bombarded with the hundreds of millions and billions of dollars that are being spent on new schools. And we have an established secondary school of several years standing, as a matter of several decades standing, that has no running water. We assume that this situation despite frequent complaints, has been allowed to reach this very, very precarious state. And just to remind people that St. Ignatius School is located in Region 9, where the matriculation rates for last year were 5%. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nigel Hughes. Ladies and gentlemen of the media, we will now take your questions. We ask the usual courtesies of identifying yourself and the agency you represent. I acknowledge Mr. Jones, Livewire News. Mr. Jones, please go ahead with your question. We're not hearing you, Mr. Jones.
Are you hearing me now?
Barely. Can you?
Okay, I have 3 questions. Should I ask all at once?
Can you ask the first 2, and then we'll come back to you, time permitting?
Yeah, I'm not muted. Are you hearing me?
Yes, I'm hearing you, and I'm asking if you can ask your first 2 questions, and time permitting,
Sure.
we will come back to you.
Sure. So the first one is for Mr. Hughes. Mr. Hughes, there has been a noticeable absence of Sherrod Duncan, a prominent member of the AFC, from the party's press conferences and activities since his unsuccessful bid for leadership at the AFC Congress. Can you provide some clarity whether his absence is a reflection of internal division within the party, or is there another reason for diminished public presence of Mr. Duncan?
Good afternoon, Mr. Jones.
The second question is...
Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh,
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead, Mr. Jones.
Mr. Jones, your second question, we can...
The second question, Mr. Hughes, during the new AFC time in office, no substantive appointments were made for the Chancellor or the Chief Justice, despite having an opportunity to do so. How do you reconcile the AFC's current call for urgency in these appointments with your party's own inaction on this matter while in government?
Thank you, and I'll answer your questions with your permission in the same order in which you've asked them. As you know, Mr. Duncan did compete for leadership. I believe that if you were present at the time of the election, there was a complete unity. Mr. Duncan was invited and participated in the post-electoral celebrations. We were all the parties who competed against each other. We were there. There are several people in the leadership of the Alliance for Change who do not appear at our press conferences. Mr. Raphael Trotman, to name one of them. And we have a broad, wide-ranging set of persons that appear based on the specific topics that we are going to address at any given time, or those that we anticipate. I have seen Mr. Duncan up to very recently in Linden, and as far as I'm aware, there are no difficulties. In relation to your second question, which is...
On the appointments.
All right. There's
no substantive appointments under the AP and AFC administration, and AFC reconciling the urgency that they're putting out now.
So, first of all, it wasn't an AFC administration. It was a coalition administration headed by President David Granger. And the appointments of the Chancellor and the Chief Justice are vested exclusively in the President. I am unable to speak for Mr. David Granger, and I personally was not part of the last administration, so I cannot possibly speak to whatever deliberations took place in that administration in relation to the issue of the Chancellor and Chief Justice. What I can certainly say, that given the length of time that I have been practicing at the bar, I certainly believe that these two persons who occupy those seats deserve the support that the Alliance for Change is giving towards their nomination, and therefore I don't think whatever your interpretation of what might have happened before, or whatever might have happened before, should constrain the appointment of two eminently qualified persons for the position.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. I recognize Davina. Davina, please go ahead with your question.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
This is Davina Baggers with Culture News. Two questions for now. Um, the Vice President said yesterday that the PPP was given a false impression that the terms of the 2016 PSA had been improved since it claims to have given its support on their
Sorry.
Davina, you are
installed.
breaking up. Can you repeat, please?
Sure, no problem.
Um,
I was saying that I was saying that the Vice President said yesterday that the PPP was given the false impression that the terms of the 2016 PSA had been improved. Since it claims
sorry, Davina, you're really breaking up.
If there's
Would
somebody
you
who's here,
prefer?
if somebody
Would
is
you?
hearing you and they can repeat your question, yes, it starts fine and then it gets garbled.
I can send my questions in the chat if you prefer.
Yeah, sure. Definitely, you'll have to read them.
I have a follow-up for Ms. Hughes, if I'm allowed, whilst you wait for Davina.
In a minute, Mr.
I don't know, Divini, you want to try again? Maybe it will improve.
Is there any improvement?
No, this is fine.
This
You
is
always
clear.
start well. It's when you get to maybe about 40 seconds into when you speak, it starts to get a little not
All right,
stifled.
since I think you caught the first part of what I was saying, would you like me to just go ahead with the latter
Yeah,
part of
you
my
said,
question?
yeah. What I did catch is that you said something the Vice President said yesterday. I'm not sure what that is.
You were saying that the PPP was given the false impression that the terms of the 2016 PSA had been improved. So they gave their support for the tax waivers to Exxon in Parliament. But since it claims to have given its support under this false pretext, do you believe that the party now have enough ground to seek a renegotiation of that contract?
As you know, I personally don't touch oil and gas issues because of the allegations that have made. I don't know if Vince wants to address that, but I don't know. Your question is premised on some allegation of falsity being provided to the PPP, and I'm not sure whether that is so, but I'll ask Dr. Adams, who is on, to speak to it, because I do not address oil and gas issues. Well, I don't address oil issues, not gas.
Yes, I think the justification for renegotiation has been vented extensively by experts throughout the media for the past several years. And yes, I think, and I did see the press conference yesterday when the question was asked of the vice president as to why did he sign for the tax exemption, concord with the government. And of course, we we saw what the answer was, which didn't make any sense, to be honest. Basically, what he said, well, they didn't have a choice. I don't know what an opposition does. What is the function of an opposition? Well, I do know, but apparently the vice president doesn't understand what an opposition is. So what he's saying is whatever the when you're in the opposition, meaning that you don't have, you're in the minority votes. When you're in an opposition, whatever the majority says goes. That's basically what he said. That their votes, matter of fact, he said that their votes wasn't going to make a difference. Well, as long as you're in a minority, your vote will never make a difference. So it's a broader aspect to his question. But I mean, there are tons of reasons for that. As I said, that has been explained very widely in the media, and we could spend the remaining of the press conference to go through them. But it was pretty telling with the vice president's answer yesterday.
Okay, Ms. Alert, I have another question or two for Dr. Adams. Can I go ahead? Can they hear me?
I hear you, Davina.
Yeah, I hear too, but Beverly?
Okay, but since the question is for you, Dr. Adams, I'll just go ahead. The VP yesterday refused to release the studies related to the gas to energy project and has directed persons to seek the information from the U.S. Exim Bank. Can you give me your thoughts on that, please?
Well, on this, in all fairness, and of course, we all have questioned. In the first place, let's go back a few steps. The PSA, which is we've always touted, the government has always said, hey, we've got to, there's sanctity of this contract. Let us not forget the PSA first of all said that for the use, and I think it's specifically in section 7, clause 7, 12, 11 or 12, but I believe it's 12. It says specifically that any use of gas outside of what has to be used on board the FPSOs, there shall be a feasibility study. None was done. The only thing you heard every time the question is asked, it's a no-brainer. On top of that, in the EIA for the gas for the pipeline, the EIA said for the pipeline, that EIA for the pipeline said that a specific EIA will be done for the gas plant. Nothing was done. So when these questions were asked, the vice president said, well, Exim Bank is going to do their own studies. So apparently now, Exim Bank has done their studies, done a feasibility study that we hadn't. I don't even know if what they're calling it officially. This is coming from the vice president. The vice president is saying that that Exim Bank has done a feasibility study and they've done an environmental study. Well, all I think the press was asking for, well, you've been saying, Mr. Vice President, all along that a feasibility study was not necessary, an EIA was not necessary, and now we're hearing that the Exim Bank has done whatever they call it, but something I guess similar, in order for them to make the decision. So in reasonableness, all that the press was asking for, and all that we have been asking for, I had even written a letter, I think, or it was in the media, show us these studies. Now, what the vice president is saying, well, we didn't base my interpretation of what he said yesterday. Well, we were not the ones who did these studies. It was the Exim Bank. I think it's a cop-out, to be honest. The government should be releasing the documents to us, because I assume that the government has it. But anyway, so for whatever reason, I don't know if they've got some kind of a well, I can't call it a confidentiality agreement between them and Exim Bank not to release something that should be public. But nevertheless, what he's saying, well, go to Exim Bank. Just trying to make it difficult for, as usual, and then, it's non-transparency. So I guess that's where we are. He said that they're not, like everything else, they're not going to release it. Shows that they're not transparent to the people. And I guess the next step is going to Exim Bank. But I think the people ought to hold this government accountable for releasing this type of information that is supposed to be public. Let's go to the EIA. If they had done an EIA, that EIA would have to have been vetted by the public. It would have been in the public domain. Now, the Exim Bank cannot do an EIA. The EIA is a process in our law, so they cannot do an EIA. So they're calling it an environmental study. Well, if an EIA was supposed to be in the public domain for public review, why can't they release this Exim Bank study to the public? And those are the kinds of questions that we ought to be holding the government accountable for.
Someone from the Guyana Chronicle. Guyana Chronicle. We cannot hear you at this point. Guyana Chronicle. Well, while Guyana Chronicle sorts out that problem, Mr. Jones, you said you had a follow-up question?
I'll just move on with my other questions. I won't worry to follow. So this is for anybody on the panel. And just to make you aware, the gynecological was really used. Just I guess that table not here. But
You're
anyway,
not coming over clearly. Please take your time. You are not coming over clearly.
okay, so this is my question for anybody on the panel. Now, given Guyana's record of economic growth projections and the government's strengthening of anti-corruption methods, how does the EFC justify its narrative of widespread mismanagement and lack of progress despite international recognition of the administration efforts in these areas?
Thank you
And
very
my,
much.
my
Mr.
last
Jones.
question
Sorry.
for Mr. Adams, I'll just put all both out here. Could Mr. Adams, I been informed that you had been in the employ of the Department of Energy. Could you say which department that he was employed at? What was the purview and responsibility of that department? And if you had any opportunity to actually work on implementing policy, contracts, or policy frameworks for the oil and gas sector whilst at the Department of Energy? Thank you.
Well,
Vince, do you want to start, and then I can deal with the first question after?
oh, sure. Well, I mean, it's easy to. First of all, I was a senior executive service employee. It's called an SCS. They call us SCSers, which is the equivalent of the generals in the military, and that's in the Office of Personnel Management for the U.S. government. It's when you're in SCS, you're an equivalent, and the SCS is like the government's. The United States government has about over 3 million employees, and the SCSers are about 0.3%. So you're the top level. So absolutely, we make policies, and of course, the Department of Energy is responsible for energy. It's responsible for developing science. We own all the national laboratories. So we do all the research and engineering on the national lab, and we also build and maintain the nuclear weapons complexes. Yes, so I was responsible for developing policies in all, whatever policies department is responsible. Well, not me, but that core of SCSers are responsible for developing policies. In addition to that, I was worked before I joined the Department of Energy, I was a senior petroleum engineer. Well, it's a reservoir and specializing in reservoir and production it used to be American Oil Company or Amoco, but now it's British Petroleum. So I was there in the petroleum industry where, we develop policies, we develop processes and procedures. I was even on the drill rigs. I did all the reservoir analysis. I was a production engineer. I was responsible throughout my 47 years of leadership in all of those areas of policy development and in technical analysis.
Thank you,
Okay.
Dr. Vince. Mr. Hughes?
Right. Mr. Jones, perhaps I should, and forgive me if this response seems a little extended, because I'd like you to get the benefit of what I'm attempting to say. $5 billion has been generated as a result of oil revenues since December 2019. Those monies have come into the government coffers. Anybody who is in government with $5 billion would have to have a development plan for that money. You have to have an overall development plan. You have to have a short, medium, and long-term plan. $5 billion, if you spend $3 billion, and I believe that's what they're contending that has been spent, $3 billion could not just fix the roads in Georgetown and its environments and throughout the country. If you look at what has been done, the primary purpose of roads, other than servicing high population areas, is to be able to make it easier for you to bring your resources from where they're located to the port so you can export them. Because most economies are driven by the amount of foreign currency that you get. So the first point I want to make in relation to that is anybody who has $5 billion is going to show some progress. You'd have to be, unless you steal all of it, it's going to be difficult not to show progress because it's a large amount of money. $5 billion coming into an economy that didn't have that volume of cash coming from a single source, oil, prior to 2020 or December 2019, obviously is going to result in some manifestation of improvement. Roads just is the easiest and most obvious, and I think this country deserves a much higher level of investment than saying that I've built roads. As I said just now, the resources of this country are most of the extractable resources, let me say the primary resources, because we have a minuscule industrial base. Most of the primary resources of this country are located far away from our port, which is in Georgetown. Now, I have not seen any major road being constructed up the Mazaruni, up the Cuyuni, and we have certainly haven't even agreed to fund the road from Kurupukari to Lethem if we were talking about developing that artery for the purposes of bringing goods out of Manaus. So the most basic developmental plans that one would expect where you had that sort of inflow into the economy, we don't even have a plan in place. Unfortunately, because Guyana has been so rudimentary in its existence up to now, people seem to get dazzled the same way people brought trinkets in a bygone time. Don't tell me that $5 billion gives you roads in Georgetown, a bypass of the city. It gives you Heroes Highway, and it gives you an East Coast Road. That is development. Every city worth its salt builds a bypass road, and it doesn't even cost $1 billion. And if you do a comparison between the cost for the development that we have seen, or what has been promoted as development, and the expenditure, whether it's $3 billion, it is completely at opposite ends of the scale. We now come to the obvious. If you have inflows of $3 billion into your economy, assuming that's what you spent and the rest is in the National Resource Fund, there's obviously going to be anticipated higher cost of living. And that is what has happened. Have we, as a people, got together and worked out how it is we are going to make sure that the cost of living does not adversely impact our population? It is clear that if you're building roads, a very, very small part of this country will benefit from that money. Where has there been any significant growth in the fortunes of the rest of the country? We have not dedicated money to the development of the most important asset of this country, which is the human resource. We have spent a lot of time talking about building $50 million schools and $300 million schools and the Bamia School, but we seem to spend very little time, if any, talking about how much money we are spending on our prize asset, our people, and how much we've spent on training them so that their skills can be upgraded, so that the country as a whole can become more competitive and that it will generate more foreign currency. None of that conversation has taken place. So we have a very lopsided discussion where we say we spent $3 billion on physical assets and we have spent virtually nothing on it, on the human development. So when you look at, for example, the nurses, the teachers, the most important asset in education is training our teachers. We should be talking about how we are going to improve our educational infrastructure. How are we going to pour more money into research in the University of Ghana? Come and tell us that you have spent $1 billion on training for lecturers or to get the best and brightest lecturers in the world in the University of Ghana and the research programs. We have not had any discussion about what opportunities we are going to offer the best and brightest in our community. So if you come out of sixth form or you come out of university and you've done exceedingly well, are we going to spend money to allow these people to go to the best educational institutions internationally so that they get the best training. We continue. At 31%, I think, was the matriculation rate for mathematics. That was the pass rate this year. Have we heard that they have spent $2 billion in improving the teaching of maths? And one of the most basic things that we do not do is that there's no problem in Guyana that does not have a precedent anywhere in the world. So have we gone to the experts to say, we have a problem with teaching maths? How do you deal with it in your society? We have seen societies like Singapore, like China, like India, develop some of the primary educational institutions in the world. We have a population of less than 1 million people. How difficult is it to take that money that we have been earning from oil and spend it on those institutions and on the best asset we have, which is our people? I'm not sure how much benefit a country gets where you have infrastructure roads which are poorly built, I dare say, but infrastructure and you have a poorly educated population. The fail rate in Guyana for people who finish secondary school is lower than the rest of the Caribbean. Where is the investment in education? So when you say to me that the AFC is criticizing the government, we are criticizing them from that perspective. Because the most valuable asset that will deliver your best return is your people. Ask Singapore, 0 national resources, 0. And they are the most successful country in that part of the world. And the entire shipping industry in China, which by the way supplies the world with all its goods and services, most of its goods and services, runs through Singapore and is managed by Singapore. We have not had an overall national development plan about what we're going to do for the next 10 to 15 years with the oil revenues. So success, my friend, is not the question of you throwing a few trinklets and bringing a mirror to me back in 1492 and telling me, oh my God, you've never seen this before, this is the best thing. Success is where we have a nationally discussed and approved framework for the short, medium, and long-term development of our people. And I dare say, perhaps one of the most egregious missed opportunities that we have been seeing since we've discovered oil and been receiving the revenue is the fact that we have no National Development Commission. We have no National Development Commission that is gathering the data, that analyzes that data, and then produces plans for the economic development of this country for the short, medium, and long term. And therefore, if you don't have that, and you have 1 or 2 people who believe that they are the repository of all the knowledge in this country, all the data in this country, and the data is not shared with the population, and they will make all the decisions, I believe you have the recipe for the perfect storm. So that is my response to you, sir.
Could I quickly, Beverly?
Go ahead.
Beverly? Yeah, let me quickly add in terms of, just to continue to add to my answer in terms of where the senior executive service employees, again, the civilian, which are the equivalent to the military generals, and the senior executive service corps employees, they are the highest ranking officials in the government. What happens when a president comes in? The president will have their political appointees, like the secretary, the undersecretary, the deputy secretaries. Those are political appointees. As a matter of fact, coming out of the office of personnel management, in terms of defining what a SES does, it says the members of the SES serve in the key positions just below the top presidential appointees. So if you move them aside, we are, I'm no longer there, but we are the top executives that are right below the top appointees of the presidential, the presidential appointees. They come and go. We are the career professionals that run the day-to-day operations of the government, meaning that all we do is develop policies. We develop all of the nuclear activities and research and engineering and science. So that's what we do. We develop policies. That's all we do. And we work with members of Congress, we work with governors, local political local politicians, senators and congressmen throughout the country. So that's what we do. We're the ones who do the day-to-day operations of the government. The political appointees come in and they leave, but we're the ones who keep things running in a stable and consistent manner. So yes, we do set policies.
Thank you for that addition and clarification, Dr. Adams. I think the nation recognizes your expertise, your experience, and capacity within the oil and gas sector. I'm going to try again to get Chronicle to field their question.
Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you now. Thank you.
Perfect. I have two questions.
And you are?
Ms. Shamar Musa, Guyana Chronicle.
Thank you, Shamar.
Mr. Hughes, you recently said you support free political participation. However, the party, in a statement, launched an attack on former member Leonard Craig for his challenge to Dr. Adams' comment without challenging the merits of his argument. How do you justify this action? And would this be the approach to any person who challenges the party's views? And my second question, if I'm allowed to go ahead.
Of course you are.
Perfect. Your comments on supposed extrajudicial killings were challenged recently by a youth leader who said it's merely a conspiracy theory and it's from an old playbook of division. Are you prepared to provide evidence to support what you're saying?
If I'm prepared to provide evidence of what? Of extrajudicial killing?
Yes.
Well, let me say this. Yeah, sure, I would. But what I would say is the 400 people who went missing during a certain era, that has been challenged by the person who was in office during that era. If you want, we can chronicle everything that has happened during the period that I've referred to. We have had jailbreaks, massacres. Lusignan happened on that particular era. Bartica happened on that particular era. I mean, this country has been littered. The history of this country since 1992 and before, I mean, before you had a death squad, has been littered with people who have disappeared. If you're going to argue, if you're asking me to argue whether it's 1,200 or 1,100 or 1,400, to me that's secondary. The issue is, how can you possibly have a country with a government and you have all these disappearances? Sadio Shaw. And recently, the court found that the state just executed Quindon Bacchus, and there was an automatic appeal as if there was no acceptance of the fact that the state was responsible for the execution of Mr. Bacchus. Now, we had in Boston. So if you're saying that somehow the volume is an issue as opposed to the perpetuation of these awful crimes by the state, then that is an interesting perspective. You had a whole commission of inquiry into the 3 people that got shot in Linden. The commission found that the state was responsible and found that the state should pay those people. The commission found that the state was responsible for shooting all of those people. And I dare say the reward of coming out of that incident is that we now have a commission of police who is alleged to have been involved in that incident and testified before that commission. So if you're asking me, it's like asking me, did 6 million Jews die in Auschwitz or was it 4 million? Is that really the question you're asking? Was there a second question before I'm accused of not answering the other one?
Thank you. Yes, there was a question in relation to...
Oh yeah, the attack on Mr. Leno.
Yes. If I may answer that, Nigel, what the Alliance for Change did was to set the matter straight in terms of the capacity and qualification and expertise of Mr. Dr. Vincent Adams to speak on matters relating to oil and gas. That's what we did. We set the record straight. Thank you.
And let me add there.
Questions?
Let me add, Beverly.
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 Yes, Mr. Jones?
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. Adams, how does reconcile what he said in relation to his career when the Department of Energy has an article which highlights his resignation or his exit from the Department of Energy, and it stated he was the deputy office manager of a project in relation to the decommissioning and the decommissioning and the of the
Dr. Adams, did you get that question? And would you
Yeah,
care to respond?
that is so laughable. You see, when you it's difficult to deal with ignorance. The bottom line is, as I was responsible for the entire site operations, which is decommissioning and decontamination was part of. Like, when you get into these type of things, it's almost impossible. The bottom line is, when it's really frustrating trying to respond to people who do not even understand what they're talking about.
So let's leave it at that, Dr. Adams. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it's ridiculous. At that same particular site in Ohio, we also were developing. Well, a lot of it is classified, so I can't talk about it in terms of science and engineering. So decommission, which is by the way, decommission. It was decommissioning and decontamination, and of the biggest weapons complexes in the world, and the budgets for those, by the way, are many times bigger than the national budget of Guyana. So I mean, I'm not going to get into to any of that serious. But let me say, getting back to the specific question, with our response, that's another situation where it's almost impossible to respond to ignorance. Because what we said was that it is impossible. The vice president in a few press conferences ago, and I think he said it more than once, he was saying that eventually when we finish paying off for the capital equipment, we will get 52%. That's an impossibility. It's an impossibility. And it was obvious that Mr. Craig and I did not understand how do you calculate profit to get the profit oil. So let me say it again as to how I did it. I think I did it the last time. In order to get the profit oil, what you do, there's two expenses that you subtract out of the total revenue that comes in for oil. There are two. There's the investment cost, which means the capital cost for buying the ships and buying equipment. Those are the capital costs. I think it's now about $55 billion US dollars for the 6 projects. So then on top of that, now you have the operating cost. After you started producing, now you've got the operating cost for fuel, for labor of not only Exxon, but even the local content labor, the subcontractors, fuel. So what you do, that monthly cost for the operations, whatever that cost is, plus whatever you're deducting to pay back that capital cost, which means is that, like when you buy a house, you have to pay a certain amount every month to pay back on that loan. So that's the capital cost, or the amortization cost that we call it. So whatever is deducted every month, you add that to your monthly operating cost. That's what's cost oil. Now you say you cap it at 75 barrels. Okay? So, or 75, let's say 75% for simplicity. So you're left now with 25%. That 25% is what's called profit oil. Now that's where it says that the government gets 50%, which is 12.5%. Is not 50% of the total revenue. It's 12.5%, and then on top of that, you get a 2% of royalty. Now, let's say what the vice president was saying, if you get rid of that capital cost to start with, you're only left now with, guess what, with the operating cost. No, unless the operating cost is zero. If the operating cost is zero, then of course you would have, there's no expense whatsoever. So now you have profit oil will be the total 100%. So you split that, you get 50%, you add 2% to that, you get 52%. But it's an impossibility for it not to have any operating cost. So all we were saying was that if you assume an operating cost of about 40%, then when you subtract the 40%, you're left with 60% profit oil. You split that, it's 30% plus the 2%, and that is 32%. If it's 30%, it's about 37.5. It's 37.5. All we were saying, it's an impossibility, and that's a fact. it's an impossibility to ever get to 52% that the vice president was claiming, because that the only way that can happen is if you have 0% of, there's no operating cost, and that's an impossibility. But on top of that, when we had criticized the billboards that Exxon was putting up to say that we were getting 52%, when I was talking about it, the vice president himself came back, and he's on record. As a matter of fact, people said that he had apologized to me, but whether it's an apology or not, he came back and he said he agreed with Dr. Adams that those billboards are misleading to the people because we cannot get 52%. He himself said that and criticized the billboards. And when he was asked to pull those billboards down, he said, well, he doesn't think that they can do anything about it. He himself agreed that 52% is impossible. So that's all we were saying. So when we hear this nonsense coming out of the president's office, who's supposed to know better, that's where the criticism came from.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. I see Davina has a question, so we might take Davina's question and then we may have to wrap up because we're fast approaching time for Mr. Hughes' other appointments. So Davina, please go right ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Willard. I'm just bringing your attention to a question that I posted in the chat, please.
Oh, sorry, can you read that out for me quickly?
Sure, no problem. I was saying that there has been an increase in robberies perpetrated by teenagers across Guyana. Could the leader state some suggestions to tackle this?
Thank you, Davina. Favorite, and most important question. It is evident that we are releasing onto the society young people who have, in large number, who don't have appropriate skills to afford them an opportunity for appropriate economic development and self-development. And as a consequence, the easiest thing that happens is they turn to crime. Absolutely to be condemned. The way that this is addressed is you first have a school system that is supposed to turn people out. We now realize that several people are falling through the cracks and are either not finishing school, or those that actually finish the 5 years, they're not getting certification. So we have to have a national program, voluntary national program, which will provide training in large numbers to people throughout all the regions of this country. It's a bit like what you call a voluntary national service. There's no compulsion here, but people have to we have to provide the institutions where people go into them. Not only are they taught and educated, but there is also a particularly significant concentration on discipline. There is no society that has been successful in the modern world in which there hasn't been a high degree of discipline, high level of education, and a high commitment to national development goals. You don't get that by allowing people to fail and continue to fail and just leave it to them to find their way. It never happens. It requires leadership. Singapore was lucky to have Lee Kuan Yew. You have there are parts of India, actually in India, I think there's a school that rivals MIT, and I'm not picking Harvard or the other, but rivals MIT in terms of the quality of students that come out of that. You have to find that. And in Guyana, because our system, our formal education system is completely failing, and I'm not attacking anybody here, this is not Ms. Manik Chen's fault. The issue here is that we as a country collectively have to find a system that in the formal education system, we have a much better output, and those that don't actually make it through that output, we have to make sure that there is further remedial, well, not remedial, there are further opportunities. So technical colleges, small population, we don't have to do this for a lot of people. And we accept that in what I'm calling sort of voluntary national service, when people go in there, of course they have their families to feed. and they will have to be paid a stipend while they're being trained. So at the end of that time, so if you go into this institution and we are providing the training, we are providing the skill set, we are certifying you, we are making sure that your family, which will not have the benefit of your presence for whatever period of time it is, gets a stipend to survive. That's what I mean about when I was talking earlier about development. You have to dedicate these resources to our best asset, which is our people. And that is the sort of program one would expect. Now, and I want to emphasize, because I can see the headline tomorrow, Nigel Hughes says, bring back national service. This is a voluntary program. You can call it whatever you want, but it's a voluntary program dedicated to educating people, instilling a high level of discipline, and making sure that while this process is being provided to them, there is a stipend that allows their family to survive. So at the end of that period, whether it's 8 months, 9 months, a year, we will then have a better educated cadre of young people who are come back into the society. The one additional point I'd like to make in relation to that is sports development. Sports development in this country has been an absolute disaster. If you look, sports development is not building grounds. Again, it's the same thing like you're building roads and you say that that's success. It's not building grounds. It's not spending $50 million on building a stadium in Berbice. That's not sports development. Sports development, which is one of the areas that several countries have used to develop their youth and give them an opportunity to get onto the world stage, is a long-term plan and program in which money is invested in coaches, money is invested in tuition, money is invested in training, and money is invested in facilities. It doesn't start with the facility. You got to start with the trainers. So this is a perfect example. In the Upper Mazaruni, which I visit frequently, and every year in August they have the games, and throughout most of the indigenous communities in August they have the games. And I say this because I've seen it repeatedly. Some of the best and most disciplined young footballers that I have seen play ball in this country, I have seen in the Upper Maz at those games. Those schools and those communities have no coach. None. Now, how difficult is it going to be to provide 2 coaches per community, put those coaches in proper accommodation, but more importantly than that is the development of the program that moves children from pee-wee football right up to professional football. Jamaica did not produce Usain Bolt. If you go way, way back to the 40s and 50s, they produced Arthur Wendt. Why? Because there is a national institution throughout Jamaica that spends money on coaching and making opportunities to young children to get coached, and there is a whole program for their development, so that the equivalent of our inter-school sports is actually a mini Olympics in Jamaica, where scouts from football clubs in the United Kingdom, scouts from universities in the United States come down and offer scholarships because they see the potential. You don't see potential because you got a fancy ground in Linden with lights. The potential is what program do you have for the development of those people? And that is what is going to take young people off of the streets with nothing to do, and therefore the mischievous mindset, it is what it is. Kids are mischievous. They're going to find things to do, and unfortunately a lot of that perhaps is going to be criminal. So we, and I say we as a country, this is not party political dispute. We have to have a program, a national program. How are those young kids think about it, those young footballers, those 15, 16, 17-year-old footballers that I see in the Upper Maz, and this is just an example, Georgetown is full of them. How are they moving from kicking ball and hoping that at the end of the year somebody holds a tournament and they can get some prize money, or you have a tournament and you do a little six-a-side in the road? That's no program. That's a commercial enterprise that is intended to sell whatever the sponsor is selling. That does not take you to the higher level. And that's one of the challenges we face as a country. We don't have programs that are dedicated to taking us as a country to the higher level. We spend most of our resources and time attacking each other and trying to have, anyway, don't let me go there. That is my short answer. Sorry, Laura wants to add something to that.
In supporting Mr. Hughes's insights and recommendations there, one of the areas I think we need to revisit strongly is the No Child Left Behind policy. And I say this because we have a system where all children, regardless of whether they have acquired the percentage to be promoted to another class, to a higher class, they're just allowed to pass through the system. And while perhaps we would not want any child to be left behind, we also seem to be robbing our children of opportunities for which they can be prepared properly. Meaning that we need to have adequate and responsive systems to ensure that whilst, are parallel to the No Child Left Behind policy and we're promoting the child, we should have systems where there is efficient and appropriate learning systems outside of the school hours. Today we have young people who pass through the system. There might be the TVET, which is the skills learning system, but it is not responsive to our children's, our youth needs and preparing them for the world of work. Now, I say this because there are many situations where we have, for example, drivers, taxi drivers, who have to ask to get directions because they cannot read the street signs, for example. And these are just very basics. We also have an education system that doesn't ensure that we have a serious look into the different levels of learning of children. Now, I say this because I've had a chance of recognizing that perhaps as being a former teacher, we have had children who may be deemed autistic, who have different learning needs, but we don't have systems, we don't have expertise to meet our children's needs. We sometimes label our children or group them into slow learners and all of these things, who really are not slow learners, but children who have different needs and different learning abilities and really different support, who need different support systems, and who can function just as well. And how can I say that is because having been a teacher, I realized belatedly that one of my daughters, who is excellent in reading, spelling, speaking, has had challenges when it came to the education systems, the formal examinations. Today, as a young adult, she performs very well in her area of work, which is creativity and all of these things. So we have an education system that is not meeting the needs of our nation's children. That today we have perhaps young people who may be now finding themselves engaged in activities that lend to these high rates of criminal activity that we speak about. So as a nation, we need to revisit that policy. We need to engage with communities and the leaders. We need to engage with teachers who are the experts in the classroom. I say this all the time, who can contribute, I know, very effectively from the national standpoint of what we need to do as a nation to support our future generations.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, in addition to sports, the creative arts. The creative arts are so essential for developing a national ethos, for allowing young people to express themselves. And I dare say the absence of any real policy in the creative arts has, I think, put us back decades. So that's also another area which perhaps might impact upon what I think Davina was asking.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hughes. If I may press on you to take just one more question from Musa, Guyana Chronicle. Quickly, Mrs. Musa.
My final question. Mr. Hughes, given that you are in the race for public office,
So, sorry, can you start again? The volume was
can
down
you
at this
start
line.
start over for us, please?
sure. Given that you're in the race for public office, do you intend to address issues of oil and gas at any time? Or would you always adopt the approach of referring those questions to other persons because of what you deemed allegations against you? And do you believe this would justify claims of your legal association with ExxonMobil?
Sorry, I missed the very first part. I heard the rest of it. So I saw you said given something.
Given that you're in the race for public office, do you intend to address issues of oil and gas at any time?
okay.
Or would you? All right.
No, sorry. Thank you very much. And I will just repeat what I'd said before. The Alliance for Change will determine who is running for public office for the Alliance for Change in the presidential position. And I have not yet been so appointed, or I may not be appointed by the Alliance for Change. So that's the first thing in terms of running for office. In relation to the question of oil and gas and the relationship that my firm enjoyed with Exxon, forgive me if I'm repeating this. I've said very clearly that I will not touch oil and gas question during the campaign. Ms. Dr. Adams and Mr. Patterson will do that. Once I am elected, I am severing my relationship with Hughes, Fields, and Stobie because I cannot be a practicing lawyer and also be president. So there's no way I would be in Hughes, Fields, and Stobie. Secondly, this position is not unprecedented. Barbados had this identical situation with a gentleman called Mr. Thompson, now deceased, who was a lawyer of some repute, who became prime minister. And of course, you have to sever the relationship you have with the entity that you worked with before. I certainly won't be directing government work to Hughes, Fields, and Stobie if that is what you're concerned about. The firm is 54 or 55 years old. It was there before I got there, and it probably, hopefully, will be there long after I leave it. So just to address that question, if and when I am elected to office, whether that is president or any other office, I certainly would be in a position to speak specifically on oil and gas because I have views on it like everybody else. I am constrained because I don't want a distraction to become that any comment I make is based on the fact that is located within the conflict of interest. So at this point, but absolutely certainly, it is clear that for the future development of this country for the next 15 years, the primary source of income is going to be the sale of oil, and the primary source of cheap electricity is going to be the supply of gas. There's no way you cannot have a position on that. I dare say if I am fortunate enough to be elected, I will be removed from allegations of conflict of interest and from the responsibility of managing Hughes, Fields, and Stobie because that relationship will be fully severed, and I would be prepared and will contribute to discussions on that. But I want to make the most fundamental point about oil and gas, and I'm happy you have afforded me this opportunity. This is the most complex political industry on the planet, and there's no opinion from any single individual, I don't care what level they are or what level I may be at, that should ever be allowed to hold sway. The future of this country should be dependent on the construction and building of institutions like national development institutions, petroleum commissions, which are very well financed, where they pay top international dollar so that we can have the best global experts gather and analyze the industry of oil and gas. It is also the most dangerously political industry on the planet. So we need to be able to have and afford to buy the best political skills and advice that we can buy globally and not assume that they are within the boundaries of this country to advise us as to how we can navigate that industry. We all have seen what happened in Iraq. It is not very difficult for someone to create a problem on our western border, and then we will be spending a lot of resources attempting to deal with that. And we have to understand that the league that we're playing in has changed. And it requires the best finance, because the persons who are not necessarily your friends, or those that pretend to be your friends but are really your frenemies, they can afford the best advice in the world in terms of how they can harm and hurt you. And it would really be highly irresponsible for us as a country to think that one single individual or one single cabinet is capable of analyzing all the scenarios and all the threats that we face. So if I am ever lucky to be in government to be able to persuade the decision makers, it would be that we should spend our money developing the institutions and the capacity of those institutions, that they hire the best and the brightest, so that this population can be served by the best possible combination of intellect and experience in relation to those industries. And finally, in that regard, we have lost our best and continue to lose our best and brightest graduates, whether they come from University of Guyana, wherever they go, and young people don't want to stay in Guyana. The only way we will begin to have a chance of surviving as a country is if we create the environment in which young people feel that it is better to stay in Guyana than to go somewhere else. And that's where we should be spending our time and effort.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. And ladies and gentlemen of the media, if you missed it, let me repeat and let me note for you that Mr. Hughes referred to allegations of conflict of interest. And so on that note, I want to thank you for spending more than an hour here with us, and I do wish you a safe weekend. Thank you.